It's time now for the political analysis of Fromm and Fuller. Al Fromm, former political advisor to President Bill Clinton, and Craig Fuller, former political advisor to both President Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. Good morning, all. Craig, from all accounts, President Biden is facing his first international crisis with a sudden escalation between Israel and its Palestinian neighbors over the last few weeks. And as it stands now, 260 people have been killed in Gaza, with over 65 of those being children, while Israel is reporting about 10 dead so far. Despite word that Biden has asked Israel to back down, that doesn't seem to be happening anytime soon. Has America lost its influence with the Israeli government on such things, despite the billions of foreign aid we are providing that country every year? Is there a way forward for Biden?
I think in my lifetime, every president that has served in office over these 70 years has somehow been dragged into conflict in the Middle East and the Gulf states, and clearly Biden is not going to be an exception. I don't think he probably ever presumed he would. It is the challenge of the presidency to find your agenda and your communications plan suddenly disrupted by world events, and that has happened. To be sure, it's a leading story. It's blocking out some of the things he would prefer to be talking about. It's also a tragedy on fairly large proportions, which is why I put this map up behind me to show the dimensions of this. With, as you said, over 200 lives lost in the Israeli bombings, and Hamas losing people. Israel losing people to the Hamas rockets. I want to try to go quickly, but touch it on this in three levels. First, globally, this feels different to me. I think the world's in a different place. We have faced a global pandemic with all too much loss of life, and somehow, and as one who deeply appreciates the right for Israel to exist, somehow this conflict seems to have a different sense about it. There are many things that have triggered this. It didn't happen suddenly. It seemed to have happened most immediately, with Israeli police shutting off microphones at a mosque. But it's that kind of thing that has sparked this violence, and the reaction quickly grew to something much larger than one would have hoped. But we've seen it before. I know Al has seen it before. I don't think anybody can really appreciate just how sensitive this is until you go into the region. I haven't been there for many years, but people live in such close proximity with such long-standing antagonism towards one another. But when I say it feels different in part because of the political overlay too. Benjamin Netanyahu has not been able to form a government. You have to wonder whether some of this is brought on to reinforce his strength as a person who's going to deal aggressively with Hamas. The Palestinian leadership, the authority, has weak leadership, and they're having a difficult time. On the other hand, to give credit where it's due, the Trump administration managed to actually bring about some change in attitudes and approaches among players in the region, with Egypt and Qatar and Jordan working in a more constructive way with Israel, even negotiating with Iran, which of course Israel has a problem with. So this action between the Israelis and Hamas stands out as sort of an anomaly in a place that's we thought perhaps was moving more constructively. And lastly, and to your question, in the US, any American president has limits on what he can do to enforce any action by Israelis, and I think Biden knows that full well. I suspect a lot more was going on behind the scenes to bring Egypt into the negotiations, for example, with Hamas, which they are in. I think we slowed down the UN Security Council for the purpose of conducting negotiations. That says to me that, there are seasoned people in this administration that are aggressively moving to try to resolve this through diplomatic means. If Netanyahu wants to push on, though, I think he does so at his own risk. He is failing to get the popular support among Jews in America. He's failing to get support in Congress from places where he's gotten support before. He's running up now, I don't know that it will pass, but running up against measures that would withhold arms to Israel because of this conflict. So his political standing in the country, regardless of how he responds hour to hour, day to day to President Biden, seems to me to be diminished. And if his reputation, if he's diminished, then probably Hamas is going to be enhanced. And the irony of this is they could take this terrible beating and yet come out of this in some ways stronger. So I think it's very complicated. I actually think that the Biden administration is probably working towards a ceasefire towards the weekend, but we'll have to see. And if that fails, then you've got a whole new and very much more difficult week ahead of us next week.
Al, you've been involved with this issue for many, many decades. What's your take on all this? Are we at a new level, as Greg was highlighting?
I think, to answer your question first, I think Biden is doing what almost any president would do. I mean, he's working for a ceasefire, but he's also given the Israelis the time to try to take out the Hamas, the terrorists, military apparatus in Gaza. I suspect there will be a ceasefire probably in the next few days. You know, Israel's 8 miles wide, and the distance between Jerusalem and Ramallah, the capitals of the two, territories, Ramallah and of Israel, is less than the distance between the capital in Annapolis and Annapolis Mall. If you're in Washington or in a European capital, it's really easy to call for a ceasefire. And there's always outrage about the number of Palestinian casualties, as there should be. But it's a very difficult situation because Hamas builds its military infrastructure in tunnels under civilian targets. They're shooting rockets from schools, or they're shooting rockets from apartment buildings, or their command center is in the Al Jazeera building. I mean, those are things that, they're done with a purpose, because Hamas isn't going to win the war, but they want to win the issue in a very ironic sense. And the more casualties, the more sympathy they get, and they feel they're stronger. So it's easy to sit here and want a ceasefire, but I tell you what, it's not so easy when you're in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem or Beersheba or Ashkelon or Ashdod or Sidrot. When you're having rockets launched at you every hour, and the air warning systems are going off every hour. And if that's happening every hour, I guarantee you, if that happened twice, two rockets in Washington, and they came from Cuba, there would be no Cuba. I mean, obviously, this is a battle that's gone on since 1948, when the UN created both an Israeli and a Palestinian state, and the Israelis accepted it, and the Palestinians, with their 5 Arab neighbor countries, went to war to drive Israel into the sea. But more recently, Prime Minister Sharon in around 2001 or 2, had an epiphany, and he said, if we're going to maintain a Jewish democracy in Israel, that we basically have to have a Palestinian state, or at least have a division, because the demographics will soon overwhelm us and we won't have a Jewish democracy. And so he withdrew from Gaza. In fact, one of my friends, a very close friend of mine, was his political advisor, and had the responsibility of removing 21 Jewish settlements from Gaza, including several that they had to send the military in to remove. So, and they gave that Gaza over in 2005 to the Palestinian Authority. But the Palestinian Authority, as Craig said, is very weak and extraordinarily corrupt, and lost the election the next year to Hamas, and the fighting started. Because Hamas' interest had, unlike the Palestinian Authority, they probably wanted to get rich on it, but at least they wanted to, I trust, they wanted to build up the economy in the territories, but Hamas has no interest in building Gaza. They want to build an arsenal. But this lack of leadership on both sides is just an enormous problem. Abbas, President Abbas of the Palestinian Authority, is over 85 years old. He has no power. There were really three precipitating incidents to this latest deal. One was what Craig said, the Israeli handling of the mosque. One was trying to move some Palestinians out of a neighborhood in North Jerusalem. And the third, which doesn't get as much attention, was the Palestinian Authority canceled an election about a month ago because they were afraid that Hamas would win on the West Bank too, because they're so weak. And Israel is in disarray. They're likely to go to a fifth election. After the last election, Netanyahu had a period to form a government. He couldn't do it. And so the president appointed Yair Lapid of the opposition. And he put together a coalition that included some far-right parties and some Arab parties. And they were a day or two from having a government, which would have been an incredibly historic government in Israel. I would not be surprised if that wasn't a trigger for Hamas too, because Hamas needs Netanyahu, just as Netanyahu needs Hamas. 80% of the Israelis support what Bibi's doing now, okay? So it may not be popular with liberal American Jews, but with 80% of Israel behind it, the American Jewish community isn't, by and large, will support it as well. But Hamas basically gave Bibi new life. They have their enemy. They'd have a lot harder time attacking a government that had Arab members of the Knesset as part of the governing coalition. And Bibi needs Hamas. The problem is Israel politics is all personality driven. If you look at each of these elections, there'll be a different leader of the opposition. It's always a new leader. It's always a new party. And then that leader will fade. And, Bibi's sort of been the steady hand, and that's why he always comes out just a little bit ahead. But nobody else has the roots or the strength to put together a coalition. In 2002, during the second Intifada, I said I met with Omri Sharon. And it was right after Sharon basically decided that Israel was going to take a new course and disengage, in a sense, with the Palestinians, let them go their own way. And Omri Sharon said there are three issues in this conflict that had been going on since 1948. One was borders, the second was Jerusalem, and the third was right of return. He said, we can solve borders in a half an hour. We'll move some settlements here or some there. And I actually met with a settlement on the West Bank where people said, we moved here because the government said we needed to have this outpost. If the government tells us to pick up and move out, we won't like it, but we'll do it. So, the borders thing can be solved, but the real issue is right of return. And that is, depending when you start, somebody owned that land first. Israel's not going to give up Haifa because it was Arab territory in 1948. So that's the issue that was happening in Jerusalem with the evictions just a month ago. So it's very complicated. I think it can be solved, but the most important thing we need now is new leadership on both sides.
I was reading a column by David Ignatius who said it's time for a reset. the columnist at the Washington Post who's covered this for so many years. It's time for a reset between Israel and the Palestinians. And surely he is right. But I think, as Al says, it's very difficult to do that when you're dealing with weak leadership. And so the quest for stronger leaders is, I think, an extremely important one. I do think if there's a way to continue the constructive activities throughout the region by these other countries, maybe the US and others in the region can put the pressure on all sides to first bring about an end to this carnage, and then on a step-by-step basis, move to something else. But it does take leadership, and right now, I think we have less of that than we need to achieve some success here.
Al Fromm, Craig Fuller, thanks very much indeed. We'll see you next week.